Fire consumed the memory of the ancient world. The great Library of Alexandria, a beacon of human knowledge, was reduced to ashes in a tragedy that echoes across millennia. But this story is not just about a fire. It is about 25 specific priceless texts that vanished that day, works that held secrets capable of rewriting history. By the end of this journey, you will know the names and stories of these lost masterpieces, understanding exactly what was taken from us. We will uncover plays that defined comedy, scientific treatises that foresaw the truth of the cosmos, and first-hand accounts of legendary voyages. What single lost book would you risk everything to recover? The work of Herodotus survives today as a fragmented masterpiece. We know him as the father of history, a title earned for his sprawling inquiry into the Greco-Persian Wars. But the 9 books we have are likely just a fraction of his original work. Ancient sources suggest his complete histories were far more extensive, organized into 120 separate scrolls. Imagine the sheer volume of knowledge contained in those missing volumes. They are not merely lost chapters, they are entire lost worlds. Scholars theorize these vanished scrolls contain detailed ethnographic studies of civilizations at the very edge of the known world. He wrote of a mythical northern people called the Hyperboreans, said to live beyond the north wind in a land of perpetual sunshine and abundance. In our existing text, this is just a brief, tantalizing mention. But in the lost volumes, he might have recorded entire conversations with travelers who claimed to have been there, describing their customs, their geography, their very way of life. Were they a real culture, their memory preserved only in these lost pages? The absence of these texts creates a chasm in our understanding. Herodotus was not just chronicling a war, he was mapping the entire human landscape of the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. His lost books likely contained precise accounts of Persian court rituals, the complex political alliances among Greek city-states, and first-hand descriptions of trade routes stretching into Africa and Asia. Without them, our picture of early Greco-Persian relations is incomplete, like trying to understand a grand tapestry by looking at only a few of its threads. We are left with the aftermath of the conflict, but missing the deep cultural currents that caused it. The loss is especially profound because Herodotus was an ethnographer, a chronicler of people. He wanted to understand why different cultures lived as they did. His missing maps and narratives represent a lost atlas of human diversity, a library of lives and traditions that simply vanished from the record. What other civilizations did he document that we have no memory of today? The silence left by those 120 scrolls is a constant reminder of how much we will never know. This absence fuels historical battles fought not with swords but with academic papers. The most famous of these debates centers on the army of the Persian king Xerxes. In our surviving texts, Herodotus reports a staggering figure, a force of over 2.5 million men. Modern historians almost universally reject this number as a massive exaggeration, a product of fear and propaganda. But what if the lost scrolls held the key to this mystery? Perhaps Herodotus provided a more detailed breakdown of the army's logistics elsewhere, explaining how such a host was supplied, or, more likely, clarifying that this was the total number of soldiers who passed through a mustering point over many months, not a single massive fighting force on the battlefield at one time. Without his full account, we are left guessing, forced to rely on educated estimates that slash the number to perhaps 70 or 80,000. The true scale of the Persian invasion remains one of history's great unknowns, a direct consequence of that fire. Beyond troop numbers, the lost books create geographical ghost towns. Herodotus described ancient cities and peoples whose locations are now hotly contested. He wrote of a fabled city of gold in the Libyan desert, a place modern archaeologists have searched for in vain. Was it a real trading post, its location meticulously recorded in a now vanished scroll? Or was it pure legend? We simply cannot know. Historians trying to map the ancient world are constantly confronted by these phantom landmarks, places mentioned in a single, surviving fragment of Herodotus, with all the crucial context lost to the flames. It is a detective story where the most important clues have been deliberately burned. The debate over the size of Xerxes's army is just one symptom of a much larger problem. Every chapter of the Greco-Persian conflict is viewed through a fractured lens. Key battles, political motivations, even the true characters of historical figures are shrouded in speculation. We are trying to reconstruct an entire era from a handful of surviving pages, a puzzle where we are missing more than half the pieces, and we do not even know what the final picture is supposed to look like. The silence of those 120 scrolls echoes in every modern history book written about the ancient world. This literary devastation extends far beyond historical chronicles, reaching into the very soul of Athenian drama. The playwright Sophocles was a titan of the stage, a man credited with writing more than 120 plays across his long life. Yet today we possess only 7 complete works. The sheer scale of this loss is almost incomprehensible. It is as if a master painter created 120 masterpieces and a cataclysm left us with just 7, forcing us to guess at the full scope of their genius from this tiny, unrepresentative sample. Those 7 surviving plays, like Oedipus Rex and Antigone, have defined our entire understanding of Greek tragedy for centuries, but they are the exceptions, not the rule. They were preserved precisely because they were considered his masterpieces by later scholars, the ones deemed worthy of copying and recopying by hand. This creates a profound distortion. We are viewing Sophocles through a keyhole, seeing only the grand, somber tragedies that appealed to a particular taste, while the rest of his vast and varied output was condemned to oblivion. Think about the titles of his lost works. They hint at a world of storytelling we can barely grasp. There was a play called Triptolemus, which told the story of the hero who brought the gift of agriculture to humanity. This was not a tale of familial curse and doom, but one of civilization and progress. What spectacular scenes might it have contained? Imagine the stagecraft required to show the first plow cutting into the earth, or the joy of a harvest that would end famine. Another lost play was titled The Lovers of Achilles. This single name suggests a deep exploration of the legendary warrior's personal life and relationships, perhaps focusing on his profound bond with Patroclus long before other authors would make it famous. How did Sophocles, a master of character, portray the inner conflict of this demigod? We have only the barest fragments, the faintest echoes of what were once powerful performances that moved entire Athenian audiences to tears and cheers. The absence of these 90-plus plays fundamentally skews our perception of Athenian tragedy itself. We have come to see it as a monolithic genre preoccupied with fate, hubris, and inescapable doom. But what if Sophocles was also a master of quieter, more philosophical dramas, or even satyr plays that blended tragedy with rustic comedy? His lost works would show us the evolution of dramatic structure, the experiments he undertook that ultimately led to the perfected forms we study today. We are missing all the rough drafts, the bold failures, and the unexpected successes that chart the true course of his artistic journey. Without them, the surviving 7 plays seem to have sprung fully formed from his head, a miracle of genius rather than the hard-won results of a lifetime of craft. This loss robs us of the context needed to understand not just one playwright, but the entire creative explosion of his era. The fire did not just burn plays, it burned the entire map of how Western drama came to be. The loss of Sophocles forces us to see only the final act of a creative life, but the fire also stole the very beginnings of systematic thought. We know Aristotle as the founder of logic, a philosopher whose dense, technical treatises became the bedrock of Western science and metaphysics. Yet the man who walked the Lyceum was famous for another kind of writing entirely. Before he composed those intricate texts for his students, Aristotle produced a series of popular works written for the general public. These were his exoteric writings, crafted as elegant dialogues, much like the works of his teacher, Plato. They were celebrated in their time not for dry analysis, but for their literary beauty and accessible wisdom. The tragedy is that these are the works that vanished. The surviving texts we study today, the physics and the metaphysics, are thought to be his esoteric works, essentially his private lecture notes, never intended for public consumption. We have been left with the complex equations scrawled on the professor's blackboard, while the beautifully written book he authored for the world has been lost forever. This creates a profound distortion in how we perceive his philosophy and its purpose. The surviving Aristotle is austere and difficult, a philosopher for specialists. The lost Aristotle was a communicator, a man who wanted his ideas to reach everyone. His dialogue on philosophy was famous in antiquity. In it, he reportedly argued for the existence of a single, divine being based on the order of the cosmos, a concept that would profoundly influence later religious thought. He wove together mythology and reason, creating a narrative that was both persuasive and beautiful to read. Another lost work, the Protrepticus, or Exhortation to Philosophy, was a kind of self-help book for the ancient mind, a compelling argument for why anyone should dedicate their life to the pursuit of wisdom. Imagine a world where Aristotle's most influential work was not a dense technical manual, but an inspiring call to intellectual adventure. How different would our entire philosophical tradition look if it had been built upon that foundation? The loss of these popular works means we see only the cold, analytical skeleton of his thought, stripped of the flesh and blood that made it live and breathe for his contemporaries. We have the conclusions without the compelling journey that led to them. The surviving texts present a system of logic, but the lost dialogues showed why that logic mattered to human life, to ethics, to our place in the universe. This is the true cost of the fire's selective destruction. It did not just burn the words of a great thinker, it burned the bridge he built to connect his brilliant mind to the hearts of the common people. We are left with the echo of a genius, but the voice that could speak to all of us has been silenced. The most tantalizing clues to Aristotle's lost world come not from his own pen, but from the pages of later philosophers who were lucky enough to read them. We know his dialogue Eudemus was a profound exploration of the soul's immortality, a work so moving it was sometimes compared to Plato's Phaedo. In it, Aristotle reportedly told a strange and powerful story. He described a man from the island of Cyprus who awoke from a deep trance. This man claimed that during his sleep, his soul had traveled far from his body, and in that distant place it had witnessed the future. He predicted a specific and catastrophic event that would later come true with terrifying accuracy. For Aristotle, this was not mere superstition, it was evidence. He used this anecdote to argue that the soul must be an independent entity, capable of existing separately from the physical form. This is a staggering thought because the Aristotle we know from the surviving works is the founder of empirical science, a man who insisted that all knowledge comes through the senses. In his lost dialogue, he was building a bridge, using a mystical story to reach a logical conclusion about the nature of consciousness. He was trying to reconcile the world of myth with the world of reason. Another lost work, his Dialogue on Philosophy, contained an even more revolutionary idea. Later writers tell us that Aristotle presented a logical argument for the existence of a single supreme God. He did not base this on faith or revelation, but on observation. He pointed to the flawless cyclical order of the heavens, the predictable motions of the stars and planets, and argued that such perfect, eternal motion could not be random. It must be the product of a single divine intelligence, a prime mover who set the cosmos in motion. This concept would become a cornerstone of medieval theology in three major religions, yet its originator is often remembered only for his cold logic. How did he make this case in a popular book? Did he use the beauty of a sunset as his starting point, or the awe one feels gazing at the Milky Way? We have only the bare logical skeleton ripped from the beautiful literary body that once clothed it. These fragments reveal a thinker caught in a fascinating intellectual transition. He was a student of Plato, immersed in a world of perfect, abstract forms and ideals. But his own mind was pulling him in a different direction, toward the tangible, observable reality of the physical world. His lost dialogues were the crucible where this transformation happened. In them, he was not yet the strict empiricist of the physics, nor was he simply repeating his teacher's idealism. He was something in between, a philosopher using the tools of Platonic dialogue to slowly, carefully, build a new foundation for human knowledge. This missing link in his thought leaves a gaping hole in the history of ideas. We can see the before in Plato's radiant abstractions, and we can see the after in Aristotle's systematic observations. But we cannot witness the moment of departure, the personal and intellectual struggle that led one of the greatest minds in history to turn away from his master and chart a new course for human thought. The fire did not just burn a few old books, it burned the intimate diary of a philosophical revolution. The systematic thought of Aristotle found its ultimate expression not in a philosophical text, but in a revolutionary administrative tool housed within the library itself. While the fire consumed plays and chronicles, it also obliterated the very key needed to find them. This was the Pinax, the work of the chief librarian Callimachus, and its destruction was a unique and catastrophic blow. The Pinax was not a book of stories or poems. It was the library's own brain, a massive catalogue often called the first of its kind in human history. Imagine a modern search engine, but painstakingly handwritten across 120 scrolls. This was the master index to the entire known world's knowledge, a bibliographical treasure that organized every single scroll in the library's collection. Its loss meant the library did not just lose its books, it lost its own memory. The Pinax was far more than a simple list of titles and authors. Callimachus and his team of scholars did something astonishingly modern. For each and every work, they compiled a detailed entry that included the author's name, their birthplace, their father's name, and even nicknames they were known by. They wrote a brief summary of the scroll's contents and often included critical notes on its authenticity and literary quality. This was a living, breathing critical database, a map to an entire universe of thought. With a Pinax, a scholar could locate every known work on medicine by a specific Greek physician, or find all the known plays by a certain tragedian, complete with a librarian's note on which version was considered the most reliable. Its destruction created a ghost library within the real one. After the fire, even if a scroll survived physically, its context could be lost forever. A charred piece of parchment with no identifying tag might be the only surviving fragment of a lost masterpiece, but without the Pinax to tell us its author or its subject, it becomes an anonymous scrap, its secret forever locked away. The catalogue was the thread that connected individual works into a grand, interconnected web of human knowledge. When it burned, that web was shattered. We are left with a universe of disconnected stars, with no chart to show us how they once formed constellations. The true tragedy of losing the Pinax is the loss of perspective. It did not just tell you what the library held, it told you what the ancient world itself valued. The critical notes within it were a snapshot of scholarly opinion in the 3rd century before the Common Era. What did the greatest librarians of their age think about the historical accuracy of a certain text? Which poets did they consider overrated? Which scientific theories did they flag as dubious? The Pinax was a guide to the intellectual tastes of an entire era, a curated tour of human achievement led by its most knowledgeable guides. Without it, we are stumbling through the ruins of that achievement blindfolded. We can find fragments, but we cannot reconstruct the library's soul. The fire did not just burn a catalogue, it burned the librarian who knew where every single book was kept. The loss of the Pnyx was a blow to the mind, but the fires of Alexandria also consumed a text of profound importance to the body, a work that literally fed an empire. When Roman legions finally razed the city of Carthage to the ground, their orders were absolute: to salt the earth so nothing could ever grow again. Yet in a stunning act of contradiction, the Roman Senate issued one specific preservation order. They demanded that a single Carthaginian treasure be saved and translated into Latin. This was not a hoard of gold or a secret map of harbors. It was a 28-volume library of its own, a monumental work on agriculture written by a man named Mago. Its survival was deemed so vital to the future of Rome itself that it was officially copied and distributed. And then, centuries later, the Alexandrian fire consumed those very copies, erasing an entire world of practical wisdom. Mago's work was an agricultural encyclopedia, a complete guide to farming in the dry, challenging climate of North Africa. Imagine the knowledge contained within those 28 scrolls, the accumulated expertise of generations of Punic farmers on how to cultivate olive trees with minimal water, how to breed the hardiest strains of sheep, and how to manage beehives in the desert heat. This was not theoretical science, it was a survival manual for a civilization, and Rome recognized its immense value. They knew that to feed their own sprawling empire, they needed the secrets of those they had conquered. The loss of Mago's work meant that this hard-won, localized genius never fully integrated into Roman practice. We know from later Roman writers who referenced Mago just how advanced Carthaginian viticulture was. They had developed sophisticated techniques for grafting grapevines to create new, more resilient varieties, and they understood soil management in ways that would not be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. They knew how to maximize the yield from a single vine and how to produce wines that were famous across the ancient world. When the library burned, it was not just a description of farming that was lost. It was the genetic code for entire agricultural systems, the precise instructions for creating abundance in lands that Rome would later struggle to control. The most poignant loss may be the knowledge of animal husbandry. Mago wrote extensively on the care and breeding of livestock, from cattle to the bees that provided crucial honey, the only sweetener available. His texts detailed methods for diagnosing animal diseases, for building optimal enclosures, and for selective breeding to enhance traits like wool quality or milk production. This was the kind of practical, bottom-up science that could have transformed the productivity of Roman estates and, by extension, stabilized food supplies for the entire Mediterranean world. Instead, that deep, empirical knowledge vanished, forcing European farmers to slowly and painfully relearn lessons the Carthaginians had already mastered. The Roman Senate saw Mago's work as the ultimate prize of war, a weapon more powerful than any army because it could create lasting prosperity. By ordering its translation, they performed one of history's greatest acts of intellectual appropriation, understanding that the true wealth of Carthage was not in its temples but in its soil. The tragedy is that this appropriated knowledge, this key to feeding millions, was then itself destroyed. The fire did not just burn a book on farming. It incinerated a lifeline, condemning centuries of future farmers to a steeper, hungrier learning curve, all because the sole surviving copy of a 28-volume masterpiece turned to ash. While Mago's work promised to feed the earth, another lost text mapped the heavens themselves with a precision that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. The Babylonian astronomical diaries were not a single book but a living archive, a continuous log of celestial events meticulously recorded by temple priests for more than 6 centuries. Night after night, generation after generation, they tracked the paths of planets, the moments of lunar eclipses, and the sudden appearance of comets, inscribing their observations on clay tablets. This was not yet science as we know it, driven by theory. It was something equally powerful, a colossal database of pure, unbroken observation. the sheer duration of this project is almost beyond modern comprehension. It means that a Babylonian priest could look back at records kept by his great-great-great-grandfather to predict the cyclical return of a planet to the same point in the sky. They were building a cosmic clock, and they had been measuring its ticks for longer than the United States has existed as a nation. The data within these diaries was shockingly precise. They did not merely note that an eclipse occurred. They recorded the exact time it began and ended, which stars were visible during the totality, and even the prevailing weather conditions. They tracked the slow, wandering motions of planets like Mars and Jupiter against the backdrop of fixed stars, noting their loops and retrograde movements with painstaking accuracy. This long-term data allowed them to detect patterns invisible within a single human lifetime. They developed the first mathematical functions to predict lunar eclipses and understood the 18-year Saros cycle that governs them. This was empirical knowledge of the highest order, a treasure trove of celestial mechanics written in cuneiform, and the Great Library of Alexandria is known to have held copies of these diaries, translated into Greek for its scholars. Their loss meant that this deep, historical baseline of evidence simply vanished from the Western scientific tradition. When the Alexandrian fire consumed these records, it forced later astronomers to start from a place of profound ignorance. The most famous casualty of this loss was Claudius Ptolemy, the great astronomer of the 2nd century. Working without the Babylonian diaries, Ptolemy had to rely on a much shorter, far less accurate timeline of his own observations and those of his recent predecessors. His monumental work, the Almagest, became the foundation of astronomy for the next 1400 years, but it was built on flawed data. Ptolemy's model of the universe, with its complex system of epicycles and equants designed to explain planetary motion, was an ingenious solution to a problem that better data could have simplified or even solved. He was a brilliant mathematician trying to reverse engineer the cosmos with only a few pieces of the puzzle. The Babylonians had already provided most of the pieces, but the key to the box had been melted in the fire. Consider the concrete impact of this loss. Ptolemy's flawed model placed the Earth at the center of a series of perfect crystalline spheres, a system that became dogma for centuries. This geocentric view was not just a scientific error, it was a philosophical cage that constrained human thought. When Renaissance astronomers like Copernicus and Kepler finally began to challenge it, they were doing so without the benefit of those 600 years of Babylonian observations. They had to rediscover, through decades of painstaking work, patterns that ancient priests had already documented. How many years of scientific progress were lost in that single blaze? The diaries contained records of rare events, like the movements of comets that visit the inner solar system only once every few generations. Without that long-term data, every comet seemed like a unique, terrifying omen, a break in the natural order. The Babylonians knew better. They had seen them before. Their lost archives held the power to demystify the heavens, to reveal a universe of predictable mathematical order. The fire did not just burn clay tablet copies, it burned the evidence that could have freed astronomy from a 1500-year detour into error, keeping humanity's eyes on the ground for far too long. Herodotus of Alexandria did what was once unthinkable. He laid open the human body to see how it truly worked. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, this pioneering physician performed public dissections on human cadavers, a practice considered taboo by both Greek and Egyptian cultures. His work was so revolutionary that he earned the title, the Father of Anatomy. He was not merely cutting, he was mapping, creating the first accurate charts of the body's inner landscape. His most profound discoveries concern the very seat of human consciousness, the brain. Before Herodotus, philosophers like Aristotle believed the heart was the center of intelligence, that the brain was merely a cooling organ for the blood. Herodotus proved them wrong. Through direct observation, he identified the brain's major structures, distinguishing the cerebrum from the cerebellum. He traced the pathways of nerves, describing them as channels for a psychic force that carried commands from the brain to the limbs. He even discovered the delicate network of veins at the base of the brain, a structure we still call the redefining or wonderful net. All of these findings were meticulously recorded in his lost texts, accompanied by detailed anatomical drawings that were the first of their kind. The true scale of this loss becomes painfully clear when we see what came next. Herophilus's empirical, evidence-based approach was incinerated. In its place rose the towering influence of Galen, a physician who lived 400 years later. Galen was a brilliant man, but Roman law forbade him from dissecting human bodies. Forced to work on animals like pigs and Barbary apes, he made educated guesses about human anatomy that were often brilliantly wrong. He assumed, for instance, that the human body contained a complex network of blood vessels in the liver that simply did not exist, a direct result of extrapolating from his animal subjects. Yet for over a millennium, Galen's flawed models became the unshakable foundation of all Western medicine. Physicians for 1400 years were taught that the human jawbone was in two pieces, just like a dog's, and that the liver was the origin of the blood's journey. They bled patients based on these incorrect maps, their treatments guided by a ghost anatomy derived from apes. How many lives might have been saved if Herophilus's accurate human diagrams had survived? The loss set medicine back by 15 centuries. Think of the suffering that could have been alleviated if physicians had known the true function of the nerves or the actual structure of the heart. The Renaissance anatomists like Vesalius, who finally challenged Galen in the 1500s, were not making new discoveries so much as they were rediscovering what Herophilus had already documented and drawn in Alexandria. They were reinventing a wheel that had been perfectly crafted, then melted down for scrap. The fire did not just burn a medical text, it burned the only correct map of the human body, condemning countless generations to suffer and die under the rule of a beautiful, persuasive, and utterly mistaken theory. Herophilus charted the body's physical truth, but another lost voice from Alexandria mapped the equally complex terrain of the human heart. Menander was the undisputed master of new comedy, a playwright so celebrated in his own time that a famous quote declared, "O Menander, O life, which of you has imitated the other?" For centuries, his plays were the peak of theatrical entertainment, performed constantly across the Greek and Roman world. His complete works were a treasure of the great library. And then they were gone. Of the more than 100 comedies he wrote, we have one nearly complete play and large fragments of just a few others. The near total loss of his life's work is a cultural black hole because Menander did not just write funny plays. He invented the blueprint for comedy as the Western world would come to know it. His stories deliberately turned away from the political satire and mythical parody of older Greek comedy. Instead, he brought the drama indoors into the home and the street. His plays were about ordinary people navigating universal problems, mistaken identities, star-crossed lovers, clever servants outwitting their grumpy masters, and long-lost children miraculously recognized by their birth parents. This was not just entertainment, it was the invention of the human comedy. The impact of this loss is measured in echoes. We know Menander's genius only through his Roman disciples, the playwrights Plautus and Terence. These later authors openly admitted they were not creating original stories. They were adapting Menander's Greek comedies for a Roman audience, translating his scenarios and characters into Latin. Their plays, which did survive, became the foundational texts of Western comedy, influencing everyone from Shakespeare to modern Hollywood, but they are the copies. Menander was the original. When his works vanished, we lost the source, the pure, undiluted vision that started it all. This means the most familiar tropes we still see in sitcoms and romantic comedies today have a ghost author. The grumpy old man next door, the clever slave who is smarter than his master, the young lovers kept apart by their parents, the braggart soldier who is secretly a coward. all of these archetypes were refined and perfected by Menander. His plays were built on character and situation, not just on punchlines. He found the humor and the pathos in everyday life, creating a delicate balance between laughter and genuine emotion that feels startlingly modern. Without his scripts, we can only see these character types in their later Roman forms, which were often broader, more farcical, and less psychologically nuanced. We are left wondering how much subtlety and depth was sanded away in the translation. The loss obscures a critical evolution in storytelling. Menander's new comedy represented a seismic shift from stories about gods and heroes to stories about us. He held a mirror up to his audience, and for the first time on a mass scale, they saw themselves reflected back with all their follies, their hopes, and their complicated family dynamics. His disappearance creates a broken link in the chain of literary history. We can trace a direct line from Plautus to Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors, and from there to countless mistaken identity plots in film and television. But the very first link, the play that Plautus was adapting, is a ghost. We are enjoying the legacy without ever knowing the originator. The fire did not just burn a collection of ancient jokes. It burned the original manuscript for the modern romantic comedy, leaving us with a brilliant sequel but without the groundbreaking first chapter that started it all. Menander's comedies held a mirror to everyday life, but one lost text dared to suggest that the gods themselves might have once been ordinary men. Euhemerus of Messene wrote a travel narrative unlike any other, a work titled The Sacred History. In it, he claimed to have journeyed to a distant island in the Indian Ocean called Pangaea. There, he said, he discovered a golden pillar within a temple of Zeus. Inscribed on this pillar was the true history of the gods, a record revealing that Zeus, Cronus, and the other Olympians were not eternal, supernatural beings. They were powerful kings and heroes from a forgotten age, exceptional humans whose deeds were so grand that a grateful and awestruck humanity had gradually elevated them to divine status after their deaths. This radical idea, which we now call Euhemerism, was a seismic shock to the ancient worldview. It proposed that mythology was not a collection of supernatural events, but a distorted form of human history. The gods were merely the founding fathers of civilization, their legends growing more fantastic with each retelling. The loss of Euhemerus' original text means we have lost the foundational argument for this theory, presented in its most compelling and detailed form. We know of it only through summaries and criticisms written by later authors, who often dismissed it as a clever fiction, but the power of his idea refused to die. It provided the first systematic, critical framework for analyzing religion, suggesting that the origins of the divine could be found not in the heavens, but in the annals of human ambition and memory. Imagine the detailed narratives Euhemerus must have constructed. His lost book was not a dry philosophical treatise, it was an adventure story. He would have described the customs of the Pangaeans and the precise inscriptions on that golden pillar, inventing a fictional history to make his philosophical point feel like discovered fact. He might have explained how a great king named Zeus unified warring tribes, established laws, and was posthumously worshipped as a sky father. Another ruler, a master of the seas in life, could have become the god Poseidon in death. This method of interpretation offered a way to rationalize the most bizarre and violent Greek myths, transforming tales of divine adultery and vengeance into metaphors for political alliances and historical conquest. Without the original text, however, we are left guessing at the full sophistication of his argument. The destruction of the sacred history deprived later thinkers of a crucial tool. Early Christian apologists, for instance, saw immense value in Euhemerism, using its logic to argue that the pagan gods were merely deified mortals, thereby strengthening the case for the one true God. But they were working with second-hand accounts. The loss of the primary source meant this powerful mode of critical thought entered the world in a muted, fragmented form. What other mythological puzzles might his original work have solved? How many other gods and heroes did he trace back to their human roots? The fire did not just burn a controversial travelogue. It incinerated the original manifesto for a rational approach to faith, a book that dared to ask if the line between a king and a god was only a matter of time and storytelling. The rational dissection of faith finds a sobering parallel in the literal fragmentation of an entire civilization's memory. Among the smoldering ashes lay a work that offered a priceless gift, a view of the ancient world through Babylonian eyes. This was the 3-volume history by Berossus, a priest of Bel-Marduk who wrote not for his own people, but for his new Greek rulers. His mission was to translate the grandeur of Mesopotamian culture for a foreign audience to ensure its stories would survive. He failed. The library fire consumed his chronicles, and with them, the only known Mesopotamian account of creation and history written from the inside. We are left with a profound silence where a mighty voice should be, forced to understand one of humanity's founding cultures through the filters of its neighbors and conquerors. Berossus did not invent his stories. He was a scholar with direct access to the cuneiform archives of Babylon, the very temple libraries that held tablets stretching back for millennia. His work was a synthesis of this epic written record, a grand narrative from the world's creation all the way to Alexander the Great's conquest. He translated the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation where the god Marduk slays the primordial sea goddess Tiamat and fashions the earth from her body. He recounted the epic of Gilgamesh, and he preserved the most detailed version of a story that would echo for centuries, the Babylonian Great Flood. In his account, the god E warns a man named Utnapishtim to build a boat and save his family from the wrath of the gods. The parallels to the later story of Noah are unmistakable, but Berossus provided the original Mesopotamian context. His loss means we can only see this foundational myth through the lens of the biblical writers who may have adapted it. We lost the native commentary on its meaning. Was it a story about divine caprice or a lesson on piety? Without Berossus, we are guessing. This loss forces us into a position of intellectual dependency. Our primary sources for understanding Babylonian history, religion, and daily life are the Bible, which portrays them as a decadent enemy, and the works of later Greek historians like Herodotus, who were fascinated tourists at best. Herodotus's description of Babylon is a prime example, a mix of genuine awe and garbled second-hand information. He famously described the city's immense walls and the hanging gardens, but his account is filled with inaccuracies that could have been corrected by Berossus's first-hand knowledge. We are trying to reconstruct a civilization by looking at postcards sent home by its visitors, while the personal diaries of its citizens have been burned. The most agonizing gap may be in our understanding of Babylonian science. Berossus is credited with bringing the deep knowledge of Babylonian astronomy to the Greek world. He would have explained the rigorous mathematical basis for their celestial observations, the very data recorded in the astronomical diaries. Instead, that knowledge transfer was incomplete. The Greeks adopted the Babylonian star catalogues and units of measurement, but the profound, centuries-long intellectual tradition that produced them remained a mystery, its philosophical underpinnings lost in the fire. We have the results of their science, but we lost the story of how they thought. What unique insights into law, medicine, or philosophy were contained in those 3 scrolls? Berossus was not just a translator, he was an apologist, making a case for the sophistication and antiquity of his culture to a new, dominant world power. His voice was the last, best chance for the Mesopotamian world, to be understood on its own terms. Its silencing created a chasm in human history. We are left with the ruins of Babylon and the tablets dug from its soil, but the guiding narrative that wove those artifacts into a coherent vision of the world is gone. A master key melted down in the heat of the flames, leaving us to fumble with the locks of an ancient past we can only partially comprehend. Berossus tried to save Babylon's story for the Greeks, but the fire erased a different kind of journey entirely, a voyage that charted the very edges of the known world. A Greek merchant named Pytheas from the colony of Massalia did something no one from the Mediterranean had ever done. He sailed north beyond the Pillars of Hercules, past the coasts of Gaul, and into the frigid, mysterious waters of the North Atlantic. His ship was not a massive warship, but a sturdy trading vessel, and his cargo was not goods but knowledge. When he returned, he wrote it all down in a book called On the Ocean. It was the first scientific travelogue of Northern Europe, a first-hand account of lands the Greeks considered pure myth, and the Library of Alexandria held the only known copy. Its destruction plunged the geography of the North back into a fog of superstition for centuries. Pytheas was the first to document the astonishing phenomenon of the midnight sun. He wrote of a land he called Thule, a place where at the height of summer the sun barely dipped below the horizon, turning night into a vague twilight haze. For scholars in sun-drenched Alexandria, this must have sounded like fantasy. How could the sun not set? Was he lying, or had he truly discovered a fundamental truth about the shape and tilt of the Earth? His description is our first written record of the Arctic Circle, a place science now knows exists, but which ancient geographers, lacking his proof, dismissed as sailors' delusion. He was also the first to connect the moon to the ocean's rhythms. Sailing the Atlantic, far from the nearly tideless Mediterranean, Pytheas was confronted by the awesome daily surge and retreat of the sea. He meticulously recorded these tidal patterns and correctly deduced their link to the phases of the moon. This was a leap of scientific insight that would not be fully accepted for generations. His lost book contained the raw data, the observations of high and low water marks that could have proven his theory and accelerated the study of oceanography. Instead, his ideas were mocked. Later Roman writers, like the geographer Strabo, who had never seen the Atlantic tides, scoffed at Pytheas' account, calling him a charlatan. They trusted their own limited experience over the documented evidence of a man who had actually been there. The loss of his first-hand testimony meant that this fundamental truth about our planet had to be rediscovered independently, a process that took hundreds of years. He described coasts where a strange, golden substance washed ashore, a substance the locals harvested and traded. He was writing about amber, fossilized tree resin from the Baltic Sea. His account of the Amber Coast provided the Mediterranean world with its first tangible link to the far north's natural resources. But without his original maps and sailing directions, the precise locations of these places became legend. Was his Thule Iceland or Norway or the Shetland Islands? The debate rages among historians to this day, a debate that would be instantly settled if we could just read his lost logbook. The tragedy is that Pytheas was a reliable witness in a world that preferred tall tales. He did not describe monsters or magic. He described coastlines, weather patterns, and the customs of the Celtic and Germanic tribes he met. He recorded their methods of brewing beer from grain and their practice of using chariots in battle. His book was a meticulous ethnography of a lost Europe, a continent before the Romans ever marched north. When his account burned, it was not just an adventure story that was lost. It was the foundational text of Northern European geography, a key that could have unlocked the map of an entire continent centuries earlier. The Romans who later conquered Gaul and Britain did so without Pytheas as their guide, stumbling into a world he could have explained to them in perfect detail. Empedocles walked through his world as a living paradox, a philosopher who clothed his scientific theories in the rhythms of epic poetry. His mind conceived a universe built from just four eternal roots: fire and air, water and earth, the very first formulation of the classical elements. These were not passive ingredients, but dynamic forces woven together and torn apart by two cosmic powers he called love and strife. Love was the force of attraction, pulling the elements into complex mixtures to form stars, oceans, and human bodies. Strife was the force of repulsion, shattering those mixtures and returning the elements to their pure, separate states. This endless cycle of combination and dissolution was the heartbeat of his cosmos, a theory of stunning prescience, and he delivered it not in a dry treatise, but in two magnificent poems on nature and the purifications. We possess only fragments of these works, quoted by later admirers, but their beauty is undeniable. He describes a unified, divine being he called the spheros, a perfect sphere where all elements are harmoniously blended by the power of love. A state of bliss before strife inevitably intrudes to begin the cycle of creation anew. What would it mean to possess these poems in their entirety? They were a bridge between two worlds, marrying the logical inquiry of early science with the mythic power of Homeric verse. He spoke of his own past lives, claiming to have been a boy, a girl, a bush, a bird, and a mute fish, a breathtaking vision of transmigration that linked all of existence. This was not mere speculation, it was a spiritual cosmology delivered with the force of art. The loss of his complete works creates a chasm in our understanding of how science and poetry once coexisted. We can see his profound influence on the Roman poet Lucretius, who, centuries later, wrote his own epic on the nature of things to explain the atomic theory of Epicurus. Lucretius followed Empedocles' model, using sublime poetry to illustrate complex scientific ideas, but he was building on a foundation we can no longer see. How much of Lucretius's fiery passion, his awe at the material world, was directly inspired by the lost verses of Empedocles? The surviving fragments suggest a voice of tremendous power and originality, a thinker who refused to separate the physical from the spiritual. Later philosophers like Plato and Aristotle wrestled with his ideas, but they summarized his theories. They did not preserve his art. We are left with the skeleton of his thought, stripped of the poetic flesh that gave it life and emotional resonance. The fire did not just burn a philosophical text, it incinerated a singular fusion of reason and revelation, a song about the elements that was itself an elemental force. Roman propaganda gave us a seductress and a tragic queen, but the royal diaries would have shown us the administrator and the strategist. These were the official day-to-day logs of the Ptolemaic court, a meticulous chronicle of every royal audience, every tax decree, and every whispered alliance that kept the dynasty in power for 3 centuries. They were the ultimate insider's account, a running commentary on the affairs of state written by scribes who stood in the very rooms where history was made. To read them would be to watch Cleopatra not through the judgmental eyes of her Roman conquerors, but through the dispassionate ink of her own clerks. What did those scribes record on a day when she received Mark Antony? Not the legendary banquets or romantic intrigues, but the hard political calculus. They would have noted the specific number of ships she pledged to his fleet, the exact tonnage of grain promised from the Nile's harvest to feed his legions, and the precise terms of the territorial concessions he granted in return. This was not a story of a woman beguiling a general, but of a monarch executing a high-stakes diplomatic treaty to preserve her kingdom's independence against the rising tide of Rome. The loss of the diaries means we can only see the outcome of their relationship, the disastrous war and the double suicide. We are missing the daily maneuvering, the drafts of the agreements, the moments of doubt and decision that truly defined her reign. We are left with a caricature painted by her enemies, while the real portrait, painted by her own hand through the actions of her court, has been scraped clean from the canvas. Beyond the famous queen, these records would have chronicled the entire dynasty's brutal reality. They would have detailed the bloody succession crises where brother murdered sister and son plotted against mother to claim the throne. The Ptolemies were a family that perfected the art of political assassination, and the diaries would have been a logbook of their crimes, naming the victims and the suspected perpetrators. They would have recorded the economic policies that made Alexandria the richest city in the world, the complex irrigation projects that harnessed the Nile, and the correspondence with distant kings. This was the raw, unfiltered data of how an empire was actually run, not the polished version prepared for public consumption. the absence of this continuous record creates a ghost dynasty. We have the grand monuments and the coins with their idealized profiles, but we lack the human pulse that animated it all. We do not know what a typical Tuesday was like for Ptolemy II, or what personal griefs lay behind the public decrees of Cleopatra's father. The fire did not just burn a set of old scrolls, it incinerated the daily heartbeat of the last great kingdom of Alexander's successors, leaving us with only the monumental tombstone of their legacy, devoid of the life that once filled its halls. The royal diaries captured the political pulse of a dynasty, but another set of lost writings contained the literal pulse of the city itself, the rhythmic flow of water and air that powered its greatest marvels. Ctesibius of Alexandria was more than an inventor. He was the founder of pneumatics, a genius who saw the potential in a simple, leaking pipe. While still a young barber, he was trying to build a counterweighted mirror for his shop. He noticed that the weight, as it descended inside a tube, would compress the air and produce a distinct musical note. In that mundane observation, he saw a new branch of physics, the power of compressed air. This led him to his most famous invention, the water organ, or hydraulis, an instrument that used the steady pressure of a water column to force air through a set of bronze pipes, creating a sound that could fill an entire amphitheater. It was the world's first keyboard instrument, a machine of both art and engineering. His written works, now completely lost, were not just lists of inventions. They were the foundational textbooks for this new science, filled with detailed diagrams and mathematical principles for harnessing air and water pressure. The most devastating loss is his work on the clepsydra, or water clock. Ctesibius was not satisfied with the simple bowls that dripped water to mark the passing hours. His designs were masterpieces of feedback control. He engineered a system with a floating figure that would point to the hour on a dial, a constant flow of water replenished from a reservoir to maintain perfect accuracy, and even gears and bells to create automated chimes and moving displays. This was not a timepiece, it was a programmable automaton, a mechanical brain that could track the seasons and the uneven lengths of daylight hours throughout the year. His lost manual would have explained the precise engineering of the valves and siphons, the gear ratios, and the theory of feedback loops that made it all possible. This knowledge simply vanished. The water clock technology that spread across the ancient world and into the medieval period were crude imitations, the ghost of Ctesibius's brilliance. For over 1,000 years, no one in Europe would again build a timekeeping device of such sophistication. The intricate understanding of pneumatics and hydraulics he codified had to be painfully rediscovered during the scientific revolution. Think of the technological stagnation that followed. The Romans, brilliant engineers in their own right, adopted his inventions but seemingly failed to grasp the underlying scientific principles he had written down. They built aqueducts to move water, but they did not advance his work on using that water pressure to power complex machines. Without his texts, the seed of an industrial revolution, potentially powered by water and air, lay dormant. His writings represented a path not taken, a high watermark of ancient mechanical science that was simply erased. The fire did not just burn the plans for clever gadgets. It incinerated the very idea of a technological future built upon programmable machines and automated power, a future that had to wait for the Renaissance to be born again from scratch. Rome's own history is built upon the ghost of a civilization it consumed. Before the Republic, before the legends of Romulus, there were the Etruscans, a wealthy and powerful people who dominated the Italian peninsula. Their culture fundamentally shaped early Rome, from its architecture to its religious rituals. The Great Library understood their importance, and it is believed to have held their own national histories, written in their own tongue. The burning of those texts did not just destroy a collection, it severed the only direct line we had to hearing their story in their own words. we are left with a profound silence, forced to interpret this foundational culture through two frustratingly indirect sources: the art in their tombs and the accounts written by the Romans who superseded them. The Etruscan language itself remains only partially understood, a linguistic puzzle with no Rosetta Stone. Their religious texts were legendary, a complex set of doctrines for interpreting the will of the gods through signs like lightning strikes and the flight patterns of birds. The Romans called this discipline the Etruscan discipline, and they adopted it wholesale into their own state religion. The highest Roman priests, the augurs, were essentially practicing Etruscan rituals. But without the original manuals, we have no idea what philosophical or spiritual beliefs underpinned these practices. Were they based on a deep understanding of the natural world, or a complex mythology we have entirely lost? We can see the rituals depicted on tomb walls, but we cannot hear the prayers that were spoken. This loss forces archaeologists into a state of perpetual guesswork. The tombs themselves are spectacular, filled with vibrant frescoes of banquets, dancers, and athletic games. This has led to the popular perception of the Etruscans as a joyous, life-loving people, in contrast to the stern Romans. But is this accurate? Tomb art is by its nature idealized, a vision of the afterlife the deceased hope to attain. It is not a photograph of their daily life. What if these scenes of feasting were not a reflection of reality, but a desperate hope for a paradise that contrasted with a harsh existence? Without their own literature, their own poetry or letters or legal documents, we cannot know the true texture of their lives, their fears, their joys, or their social conflicts. The Roman accounts, our other main source, are deeply problematic. Roman historians like Livy wrote about the Etruscans centuries after their political power had been broken. Their descriptions are often biased, portraying them as decadent and tyrannical, a necessary foil to justify Rome's own rise to power. It is the history of the victor writing about the vanquished. Imagine trying to understand modern France based solely on descriptions written by English historians from the 19th century. The nuance, the internal perspective, the authentic voice is entirely missing. The most agonizing gap may be in our understanding of their political and social structure. We know that Etruscan women enjoyed a level of social freedom that shocked the Greeks and Romans. They are depicted at banquets alongside men. Their tombs often bear their own names with pride, and they appear to have been literate. What did these women think about their own society? Did they have their own poets or philosophers? A single surviving Etruscan novella or a book of laws would tell us more about their world than 1,000 silent artifacts. The fire did not just burn the history of the Etruscans, it burned their humanity, reducing a complex, influential civilization to a series of beautiful but mute paintings on a tomb wall, their true voice extinguished forever. The voice of the Etruscans was silenced, but another was shattered into 1,000 pieces, a loss that resonates with a uniquely personal ache. We possess only whispers of the poet Sappho, a woman so revered in antiquity they called her the 10th Muse. Her complete works filled 9 entire volumes in the Great Library, a lifetime of lyric poetry dedicated to love, longing, and the intricate lives of women on the island of Lesbos. Today, we have one single poem surviving in its entirety and a collection of fragments, some no larger than a fingernail, salvaged from the shreds of papyrus used to wrap Egyptian mummies. This is the literary equivalent of viewing a magnificent mosaic through a handful of scattered, beautiful tiles. The scale of the loss is almost intimate. Sappho did not write epic tales of gods and heroes. She turned her gaze inward, crafting verses about the physical ache of desire, the sting of rejection, and the tender bonds between friends and students. In one of her most famous surviving fragments, she describes the visceral impact of seeing the object of her affection, a moment so powerful it feels like a physical assault. She writes that her tongue breaks, a thin flame runs under her skin, and there is no sound in her ears, just a drumming in her own pulse. this is not a distant, formal observation. It is a raw, first-person account of human emotion that feels as immediate today as it was written 2,600 years ago. To have lost 9 volumes of this is to have lost an entire emotional lexicon from the ancient world. Her poetry was the primary window into the lives and inner worlds of women in a society that left us few such records. Her work describes the education of young women, their rituals, their friendships, and their private conversations. These were not public performances for a male audience, but songs shared within a community of women. What other dimensions of female experience did she capture that we can now only guess at? The fragments we have are agonizing in their beauty precisely because they are fragments. One poem ends mid-sentence with the words, "But I am not one to hold a grudge," and we are left forever wondering what came after that comma. Another begins with the simple, devastating line, "I simply wish to die," and we will never know the full story behind that despair. We are left with these brilliant shards and the crushing weight of the stanzas that connected them. Later male poets and philosophers quoted her work admiringly, but they did so to pluck a beautiful phrase, not to preserve the whole. Her legacy was filtered through their appreciation, her complete artistic vision reduced to a series of famous one-liners. The fire did not just burn the poems of Sappho, it incinerated the most authentic and powerful female voice to survive from antiquity, leaving us with a ghost who sings only in broken, haunting melodies. The story of Jason and his Argonauts is a cornerstone of Western mythology, yet the version we know is not the only one that existed. A very different telling of this epic voyage was composed by an Alexandrian scholar named Dionysius Ctesibius, whose name means the leather-armed. His Argonautica was not a poem, but a sweeping prose epic, a rationalized and expanded history that aimed to strip the legend of its supernatural elements and present it as a plausible account of heroic exploration. This was the version that was heavily used by later historians like Diodorus Siculus, and its loss forces us to see this foundational story through a single, poetic lens, missing the fascinating alternative that once stood beside it. Dionysius approached the myth not as a bard but as a scholar. He systematically removed the gods from the narrative. In his version, the golden fleece was not a magical pelt guarded by a dragon, but a simple, valuable sheepskin, perhaps dyed with gold, that was the central object of a political and economic dispute. The clashing rocks that nearly crushed the Argo were not sentient boulders, but a dangerous tidal phenomenon in the Bosphorus Strait that the hero's ship barely navigated through skill and timing. He transformed a story of divine intervention into one of human ingenuity and endurance, a tale of ancient mariners pushing the boundaries of the known world. This rationalist perspective would have fundamentally altered our understanding of the characters. What was Medea in this version? Was she still a sorceress, or was she a brilliant foreign princess, a master of herbal medicine and political strategy whose knowledge seemed like magic to the Greeks? Her infamous betrayal of her father and the murder of her brother could have been framed as desperate acts of a woman caught between two worlds rather than the crimes of a witch. The loss of Dionysius' text means we are stuck with the monstrous, vengeful Medea of Euripides' play, a character defined by her supernatural rage. His version might have given us a more nuanced, even sympathetic portrait that explored the human cost of Jason's ambition. The most profound change might have been to the heroes themselves. The familiar poem by Apollonius of Rhodes, which did survive, presents Jason as a somewhat reluctant hero, often brooding and dependent on the help of others. Dionysius' prose epic, written earlier, could have portrayed a very different Jason, a decisive leader and a brilliant strategist, a man whose cunning was his true strength, not a flaw. This would flip the entire moral of the story on its head. Was the quest for the Golden Fleece a cautionary tale about broken oaths and divine retribution, or was it a celebration of human exploration and the ruthless drive for resources? We have lost the argument that would have given the legend a completely different meaning, a version where heroes succeeded by their own wits, not by the favor of the gods. The fire did not just burn an alternative take on a famous myth. It incinerated a whole school of thought, a rationalist tradition that sought to find the human history buried within the epic poetry, leaving us with only the magical version and silencing the ancient world's own best attempt to find the truth behind its greatest stories. Centuries before Copernicus, a Greek mind had already solved the cosmic puzzle. Aristarchus of Samos looked at the heavens and saw a truth so radical it was rejected by his own civilization. He proposed that the Earth was not the center of all things, but merely one of several planets all orbiting a central, fixed sun. His original treatise on the sizes and distances of the sun and moon survives only as a fragment, a work on celestial geometry. The real bombshell, the book where he laid out his full heliocentric model, was lost entirely. We know of it only because Archimedes and a few other thinkers mentioned it in their own works, often to disagree with it. They preserved the idea only as a curious footnote, a brilliant error. The destruction of his complete argument was a catastrophe for human knowledge. Without the original text to study and champion, this correct vision of the solar system simply faded from view. The intellectual momentum shifted to the far more intuitive, Earth-centered models of Aristotle and later Ptolemy. Think of the immense weight of common sense that had to be overcome. We feel the ground solid beneath our feet. We watch the sun rise in the east and set in the west. It feels like everything moves around us. Aristarchus used pure reason and mathematics to see beyond that illusion, but his proof was delicate, a thread of logic that was easily severed. His model would have required the stars to be almost unimaginably distant, because if the Earth orbited the sun, the positions of the stars should appear to shift slightly throughout the year, an effect called stellar parallax. Aristarchus argued this meant the stars were just so incredibly far away that the shift was too tiny to be seen with the naked eye. This was a staggering leap of cosmological thinking, but without his detailed calculations and persuasive writing, it sounded like nonsense. The loss of his book meant that when Ptolemy constructed his own grand system, the Almagest, he was building on a foundation with its most important cornerstone missing. Ptolemy's geocentric model, with its complex epicycles and equants, was a masterpiece of error, an incredibly intricate mathematical system designed to explain the motions of the planets while keeping the Earth wrongly at the center. It was a beautiful, self-consistent lie that would dominate astronomy for 1400 years. The Church later adopted this Earth-centered universe because it fit the theological view of humanity as the central concern of a divine creator. The heliocentric model was not just a scientific challenge, it was a philosophical and religious heresy. One has to wonder if Aristarchus' original text had survived, circulating in dozens of copies across the Mediterranean world. Could it have changed everything? Would its mathematical elegance have convinced enough scholars to create a sustained alternative tradition? The loss of his work did not just misplace a theory. It closed a door in the human mind for nearly 2 millennia, a door that led to our true place in the cosmos. We were left staring at our own shadows on the cave wall, convinced they were the only reality. Buried within the library's scrolls was a map of the Greek imagination itself. This was the mythographic library, a colossal project to collect and catalog the local myths, hero tales, and foundation stories from every corner of the Greek world. Before the great epics of Homer and Hesiod standardized a national pantheon, Greece was a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own patron deities, its own peculiar rituals, and its own homegrown heroes whose stories were never written down in famous poems, but passed along in village festivals and local priesthoods. This compilation was an encyclopedia of that breathtaking diversity, a record of Greek religion in its raw, untamed, and deeply regional form. Its loss means we see the Greek gods through a single, polished lens, missing the vibrant, contradictory, and deeply personal ways they were actually worshipped by ordinary people. Imagine a story of Zeus from a tiny mountain village in Arcadia, a version where he was not a serene king on Olympus, but a fearsome, shape-shifting deity of the wilds, worshipped with secretive, ancient rites. The major texts we have today present a unified family of gods with clear domains, but the local myths would have shown us a Zeus who was also a patron of blacksmiths in one town and a god of the noonday heat in another. These were not inconsistencies, they were the living reality of faith, where a god's power was shaped by the landscape and the needs of the community that relied on them. The library's collection would have been the only place where a scholar could compare the founding legend of Athens as told in Attica with the version preserved in Sparta, a rival city that would have surely told the story to its own advantage. It would have catalogued the obscure heroes who were giants in their own villages, men and women who slew local monsters or discovered sacred springs, but whose fame never traveled beyond the next valley. These local heroes were the beating heart of Greek religion, figures closer to the people than the remote Olympians, and their stories explained the very soil under their feet, why a certain rock formation looked the way it did, or why a particular grove was considered holy. When this mythographic archive burned, it did not just burn a list of stories. It incinerated the cultural DNA of hundreds of distinct communities, the very reasons why a temple was built on one hill and not another. We are left with the official pan-Hellenic version of Greek mythology, a grand but homogenized narrative that has smoothed over all the fascinating, rough edges of local belief. The silence left by this loss echoes in every modern retelling of these ancient tales, which can never quite capture the true, chaotic, and deeply human richness of how the Greeks themselves actually experienced their gods. That radical vision of a borderless world was not born in our modern era. It was first articulated in the 3rd century before the Common Era by Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. His lost book, titled The Republic, laid out a political philosophy so revolutionary it would challenge any society even today. Zeno envisioned a true cosmopolis, a world city not bounded by walls or citizenship, but united by shared reason and virtue. In this ideal state, the traditional pillars of society would be rendered obsolete. He argued for the abolition of currency, seeing it as a source of corruption and inequality. He proposed doing away with marriage as a legal institution, suggesting that relationships between men and women should be based on mutual consent and virtue alone. Even temples and courts of law were deemed unnecessary, for in a community of truly wise individuals, there would be no crime to prosecute and no need for formal worship. This was not an anarchist's dream, but a philosopher's blueprint for a society governed solely by natural law. The tragedy is that we have no copy of Zeno's original text. It was consumed by the flames, leaving us to understand his radical ideas only through the critiques of his opponents. Later writers, like the skeptical philosopher Philodemus, summarized Zeno's arguments only to dismantle them, often portraying his republic as an impractical, even dangerous fantasy. They focused on the most shocking aspects, like the proposed community of wives and children, stripping the philosophy of its deeper ethical context. We are left with a caricature, a distorted reflection of a profound argument for human unity. This loss obscures the true radicalism of early Stoic thought. The later, more famous Stoics like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are known for their focus on personal resilience and inner peace, a philosophy that could be comfortably adopted by a Roman emperor. But the original Stoicism, as founded by Zeno, was a deeply social and political project. It was not about retreating from the world, but about transforming it completely. His Lost Republic was the manifesto for that transformation, a detailed argument for how humanity could shed its tribal divisions and live as a single, rational family. Without it, we can only guess at the logical steps that led him to such startling conclusions. How did he propose to handle disputes without courts? How would a moneyless economy actually function on a large scale? The fire did not just burn a political treatise, it incinerated the foundational argument for a universal human community, a vision of global citizenship that the world is still struggling to achieve 2,000 years later. Long before Alexander's army marched east, a Greek explorer was already mapping the river highways of India. Sent by the Persian king Darius I, a man named Scylax of Carianda embarked on an epic voyage of discovery. His mission was to follow the Indus River from its upper reaches all the way to the sea, and then to sail west along the coast, charting the shores of the Indian Ocean. He succeeded, and his account of this journey, titled The Travels of Scylax, became the first detailed Greek description of the Indian subcontinent. Its loss in the fire erased a foundational layer of geographical knowledge, a world seen through the eyes of a peaceful explorer, not a conqueror. Scylax sailed for 30 months, a journey that would have brought him into contact with countless cultures and kingdoms. His lost book was not just a sailor's log of coastlines, it was a rich ethnography. He would have described the intricate social structures of the peoples living along the Indus, their unique customs, their religious practices, and the astonishing wildlife they shared their land with. He saw things no Greek had ever reported, from the monsoon rains that reversed the flow of rivers to the elephants that served as instruments of war in local armies. This was priceless intelligence gathered for the Persian Empire, but preserved for the world in the Library of Alexandria. Its destruction meant that when Alexander invaded India generations later, his generals were operating with a significant informational deficit. They were rediscovering a world that had already been meticulously documented. The loss of this text creates a ghost map of the ancient world. Scylax provided the first names for geographical features that would later become famous. He gave the Greek world its name for the Indus River itself, and he described the distant island of Taprobane, which we know today as Sri Lanka. His account would have clarified trade routes and political boundaries that were already old when Alexander was born. How many diplomatic mistakes or military misadventures could have been avoided if his work had survived as a standard reference? The silence left by his travelogue is a reminder that exploration is fragile, that a single copy of a manuscript can hold the only memory of a world that has since vanished. When his account burned, it was not just a story of a river voyage that was lost. It was the West's first, and for a long time best, chance to understand the Indian subcontinent on its own terms, a window that slammed shut for centuries. The rigid image of Sparta shatters with the whisper of a single name, Alcman. While history remembers the Spartans as a society of relentless warriors, their most celebrated poet wrote not of battle, but of the shimmering night sky and the grace of young women dancing. His choral lyrics, performed by choruses of Spartan girls at public festivals, were a cultural treasure, and their near-total loss confines us to a one-dimensional view of a deeply complex civilization. Alcman's poetry was the soundtrack to a Sparta we have almost entirely forgotten, a place of public artistry and nature worship that existed alongside its famous military discipline. We possess only fragments, but they are breathtaking. In one, he describes the stars as a flock of fireflies tethered to the dark fabric of the sky. In another, he paints a scene of his chorus members, comparing one girl to the sun, and declaring that the radiant light of her face makes any other star fade into nothingness. This is not the language of a barracks, but of a society that valued beauty, music, and the divine feminine. The absence of his complete works means we are deaf to the songs that defined Spartan religious life and the coming of age of its daughters. These were not private recitals. His Parthenaea, or maiden songs, were performed at grand civic events, with teams of young women singing and dancing in intricate patterns. Their lyrics wove together local myths, playful rivalries between chorus members, and deep observations of the natural world. Through these performances, the girls were not just entertaining, they were embodying the ideals of their community, their grace and harmony seen as a reflection of the city's own order and a prayer for its continued favor from the gods. Losing these songs is like losing the libretto to a grand opera. We can see the stage and the actors, but we have no idea what they were singing about. This creates a profound historical gap. Later sources, written by Athenians and other outsiders, relentlessly focused on the Spartan military machine, the agoge training system, and the infamous austerity. They created the enduring stereotype of the unemotional, laconic warrior. Alcman's poetry proves this was only half the story. His work gives voice to the other half of the population, the women who managed estates, raised children, and participated in vibrant cultural rituals while the men were away. What did these girls sing about their hopes, their friendships, or their own role in this unique society? The fragments suggest a world where female beauty and athletic prowess were publicly celebrated, not hidden away. Without Alcman's full narratives, we cannot hear their side of the story, and we are left with a history of Sparta written almost entirely about its men and almost entirely by its enemies. The fire did not just burn the poems of Alcman, it incinerated the primary piece of evidence for a vibrant, artistic, and surprisingly lyrical Sparta, leaving the clang of bronze and iron to drown out the music that once gave it a soul. Democritus saw a universe built from invisible, indivisible particles, a theory of atoms born 2 millennia before the world was ready to accept it. But his genius was not confined to cosmic speculation. He turned his atomic gaze toward a phenomenon so familiar it seemed magical, the nature of color itself. His lost treatise on colors was a foundational work of ancient optics, an attempt to explain the entire visible spectrum not through divine whim, but through the physical interaction of atoms and the human eye. Later authors cited it with deep respect, suggesting it contained a sophisticated theory of how different surface textures and atomic arrangements either reflected or absorbed light to create the sensation of red, blue, or green in a perceiver. This was a science of perception, a radical idea that color was not an inherent property of an object, but a relationship between that object's physical structure and the observer. The loss of this text meant the ancient world lost its best chance to build a physics of color. Instead of a physical theory, the dominant explanation that survived was Aristotle's. He proposed that color was a quality inherent in an object, a potentiality that was actualized by the presence of light. It was a philosophical description, not a mechanical one. He saw color as a mixture of light and dark, a concept that, while influential, lacked any explanatory power for why a specific flower appears yellow or a ruby appears red. Without the competing physicalist argument from Democritus, Aristotle's view went largely unchallenged for centuries. This single loss stifled an entire branch of inquiry. What experiments did Democritus describe? Did he grind different minerals to see how the fineness of their particles changed their hue? Did he note how a wet stone appears darker because its surface texture has changed, altering how its atoms interact with light? His treatise might have contained the seeds of 1,000 later discoveries in chemistry and physics. The principles of light absorption and reflection that would not be firmly established until the work of Newton were potentially present in this ancient text, a roadmap for a scientific revolution that was incinerated before the journey could even begin. The silence left by his treatise on colors is a haunting one. It represents a path of scientific inquiry that was closed off, forcing humanity to see the rainbow as a mystery for over 1,000 years longer than necessary, a vibrant puzzle whose key had been melted down in the fires of Alexandria. One man saw the entire brutal spectacle from its very center. Hieronymus of Cardia was not a historian who consulted dusty archives. He was a soldier, a diplomat, and a statesman who fought and negotiated alongside the Titans who tore Alexander's empire to pieces. His history of the 40 years of conflict following Alexander's death was the ultimate insider's account, a chronicle written by a man who had shared a campfire with Eumenes, bargained with Antigonus one eye, and witnessed the rise of Ptolemy. He was there for the bloody partition of a world, and he wrote it all down. His work, known as the History of the Successors, was the definitive source for this chaotic, foundational period. And its loss forces us to view this epic struggle through a cracked and distorted lens. We are left relying on the much later, dramatized narrative of Diodorus Siculus, a compiler who wrote centuries after the events, working from secondary sources and prone to simplifying complex political maneuvers into tidy moral tales. The difference is the difference between reading a general's own battlefield dispatches and reading a romantic novel written about the war 300 years later. Hieronymus provided the granular, tactical truth. He would have explained not just that a battle was won, but exactly how the shifting loyalties of a single cavalry unit decided the outcome. He knew the personal grudges and secret alliances that drove these men, the private promises broken in the pursuit of power. He understood the logistics, the crippling cost of fielding a massive army, and the drought that forced a retreat more effectively than any enemy spear. This was history written with the dust of the marching road still on the parchment. The loss of his narrative creates a fog of war over the entire era. Take the complex character of Eumenes of Cardia, a Greek secretary who became one of Alexander's most capable generals and a major player in the subsequent wars. In the surviving accounts, his story is a dramatic roller coaster, but the intricate political chess game he played is often reduced to a simple story of loyalty and betrayal. Hieronymus, who was his friend and compatriot, would have given us Eumenes' own rationale, his strategic genius, and the immense political challenges he faced as a Greek maneuvering among a Macedonian officer corps. We have lost the protagonist's own testimony, leaving only the sketch provided by his enemies and later summarizers. This absence robs us of the human scale of these events. Diodorus gives us the grand sweeps, the movements of armies, and the fates of kingdoms, but Hieronymus could have told us what the common soldiers said around their fires the night before a decisive battle. He could have described the expression on Antigonus's face when he received news of a rival's treachery, or the exact words spoken during a tense diplomatic summit that averted a war or started one. His history was filled with the kind of vivid, first-hand details that transform names on a map into living, breathing, flawed human beings. Without it, the wars of the successors can feel like a colossal, impersonal machine grinding forward, when in reality it was a chaotic and deeply personal struggle between a handful of ambitious men who had been comrades in arms. The silence left by Hieronymus' lost history is the sound of a door closing on the true, unvarnished story of how Alexander's dream died, and how the map of the ancient world was redrawn in blood and fire by the men who knew him best. The final lost text whispers of secrets meant only for the dying. Concealed within the library were the sacred scriptures of the Orphic Mysteries, a collection of hymns and ritual instructions that promised its initiates a way out of an endless cycle of suffering. Unlike the public, state-sponsored festivals for Zeus or Athena, the Orphic rites were intensely personal, focused on the salvation of the individual soul. Their texts contained a creation myth so different from Hesiod's standard account that it would have rewritten our entire understanding of Greek religious belief. In Hesiod, the world begins with chaos. In the Orphic version, it begins with Time, who creates a silver egg from which the first god, Phanes, emerges in a blaze of light. This was a cosmology of profound duality, teaching that humanity was born from the ashes of the Titans, who had devoured the infant god Dionysus. We carry within us, therefore, a fragment of the divine trapped in a titanic, sinful body, and the purpose of the rituals was to purify that spark and achieve liberation. The loss of these manuals means we have lost the primary script for the most influential mystery religion of the ancient world. We are left guessing at the precise incantations, the dietary restrictions, and the sacred dramas that initiates underwent to prepare for the afterlife. What words were spoken to ease the soul's passage into the underworld? What symbolic acts promised a better existence in the next life, freeing one from the wheel of reincarnation? The fragments we have, often found inscribed on thin sheets of gold and placed on the chests of the dead, are cryptic and beautiful. They instruct the soul on what to say to the guardians of the afterlife, identifying themselves as a child of earth and starry heaven, but freed from the cycle of pain. Without the full context of the rituals that produced these artifacts, they are like single pages torn from a complete guidebook to eternity. This loss obscures a vital thread of spiritual descent in the ancient world. Mainstream Olympic religion was a transactional affair. You made a sacrifice to a god and hoped for a favor in return, usually involving public success or a good harvest. The Orphic mysteries offered something radically different, a path to personal redemption and a direct, intimate connection with the divine. Their destruction silences the most significant alternative to the pagan mainstream, a voice that spoke of sin, purification, and eternal reward in terms that would later deeply resonate with early Christian thinkers. We are left to wonder how many other paths to the sacred flourished in the shadows of the great temples, their wisdom entirely lost because the one library that dared to preserve their secrets was reduced to ashes. 25 worlds of thought turned to smoke and scattered on the wind. These were not just scrolls, they were entire conversations with the past, silenced forever. The fire did more than destroy a building. It shattered the continuum of human memory, leaving us with a fractured history where we must guess at the shape of the missing pieces. We are left with the echo of a question, a ghost in the architecture of our knowledge. What if Aristotle's popular dialogues had survived to inspire the common person, not just the scholar? What if Herophilus's accurate maps of the human body had guided physicians for centuries instead of Galen's flawed guesses? The loss is not a single event locked in antiquity. It is an ongoing silence that shapes our present, a library of ghost books that continues to haunt the very foundations of science, literature, and philosophy. Each of these 25 texts represents a fork in the road of human understanding, a path of discovery that was closed off, forcing us to wander in intellectual circles for generations. The true cost of Alexandria is measured in the centuries of progress that were lost, the questions we are only now learning to ask again, and the profound connections to our own past that were irrevocably severed. So we are left with a final, deeply personal mystery. If you could walk into those smoldering ruins and salvage just one of these lost masterpieces, which would you choose? Would you recover the scientific proof of a sun-centered universe from Aristarchus, preventing a millennium of error? Or would you save the intimate, lyrical voice of Sappho, restoring a vital part of the human heart to history? The choice reveals what we value most about our own story. Tell me which book you would bring back from the ashes and share your reason in the comments.